My daughter gave me a little bit of a hard time after last week's lecture. She says I tell too many jokes involving rabbis, and usually at their expense. And I love those jokes so much, you know, so I'm not sure if I can let go of them so easily. But I will try at least for the opening joke. It goes like this. I apologize to those of you who've heard this joke several times. As you know, I only know about a dozen or so, and I just recycle them. But a joke goes like this. A man goes to his favorite diner, and he's sitting there, and he's ordered his meal and so on, and the waiter delivers his soup, and then the waiter looks up and he sees the man gesturing to him. So the waiter comes over to him and says, "Is there something wrong, Mr. Goldstein?" And he says, "I want you should taste the soup." And he says, "Is there something wrong with the soup? We've had this soup many times and whatever." And he says, "I want you should taste it. I'll bring you another bowl right away, no question. I want you should taste the soup." He says, "There's something wrong. We serve the same soup every day." He says, "I want you should taste the soup." So he says, okay, I'll taste the soup. Where's the spoon?" Aha! No rabbis in that joke, okay? All right, the rabbi jokes are definitely funnier. Anyways, tonight's topic is one that's very close to my heart. I hope you will find it as fascinating as I do. I'm wondering if perhaps part of the reason for my fascination is because I share a professional interest with the subject tonight, because we're going to look at Heinrich Graetz, the first encyclopedic Jewish historian of all time. Many of you probably have, at one point in your lives, owned at least 6 copies of Heinrich Graetz's multiple-volume History of the Jews. For about probably close to a century, it was the number 2 bar mitzvah gift of all time, right after a fountain pen. There was that, and there was Heinrich Graetz. Now you get it on an e-book, give him an iPod or an iPhone, and it gets the Graetz on it. But we're going to talk about his life and his work and his impact on the Jewish psyche, which was really quite significant, both in its positive aspects and also, unfortunately, as we shall see, in its negative aspects. Because a lot of the internet audience has been asking for kind of a statement of why are we doing this? I mean, there are like 200 of these lectures up on the web now with all these people. Why are we doing it? And I'm not exactly sure. So I spent some time and I put together this short trailer, which I'd like to play for you. It's 1 minute, 25 seconds, but I think it encapsulates my philosophy of Jewish history and the point of this entire exercise, which flows very well into our topic of Heinrich Graetz. So here's a 1.25 minute. Whoops, I got to turn that ad off. Let's see if I can make it louder. Identity is really important to me. I grew up in this small milling town in northern Ontario, Canada, where I was the only Jewish child. I grew up as an other, as an outsider. You got to put the camera on the screen. Personal, spiritual, scholarly energy, trying to figure out really what does it mean to be Jewish. And I found that the search for meaning and identity is one of great value. We believe that the study of Jewish history adds meaning and value to human existence in general for both Jews and non-Jews. We believe that academic Jewish history lectures need not sacrifice content to be entertaining. We believe that access to high-quality information on Jewish history should be free. We believe that shared intellectual curiosity about Jewish history is a great way to build communities. And we believe that Jewish history is one of many paths to the study of Torah, and that Torah study is enhanced by a fuller understanding of Jewish history. And that's it. Okay, so basically what that means, just to go over our manifesto very quickly, we believe in the intrinsic value of the study of Jewish history for Jews and for non-Jews. It's just says something about the human condition and the trials and tribulations of life on this planet that I think has value for everyone. We believe that academic Jewish history should be fun. Like, we should enjoy ourselves, that this should not be a tircha, should not be a difficult thing for us to do. We believe very strongly that this should be free. I mean, we're very grateful for the sponsors that we have. This lecture, by the way, was sponsored anonymously this week. Thank you very much. And the idea, and it's wonderful that Young Israel allows us a space to do this in and provides for the students that do the videography and things. But the point is, we have all these people out there in America and beyond who wouldn't have access to it unless we made it free. So we have that as a very strong value. And we believe that the study of Jewish history is one way that people can get to the study of Torah, and that the people who study Torah can have their learning enriched by what we do in Jewish history. So that's basically it. That's the manifesto. It's all about identity. It's all trying to build Jewish identity in particular, but identity of the human condition in general. Okay, I will not take any questions. We better go straight to the material. So we're going to talk tonight about Heinrich Graetz. Here's a great photo of him. His years are 1817 to 1891. And as I mentioned earlier, Graetz was the first encyclopedic Jewish historian. What do I mean by encyclopedic? We live in an era where Graetz has fundamentally transformed our sense of Jewish history, where, of course, you can go to Barnes & Noble or you can go to Amazon and you can find hundreds of Jewish histories, monographs and larger topics and so on, and it's nothing rare, but he was the first one to actually try and put in a modern European language that was accessible to everyone a complete history of the Jews from the beginning until the present day, which at that point would have been, the late 19th century Germany. There were a couple of attempts, one by a Christian, one by a Jew, to write a slim one-volume history of the Jews, but really it was more like a chronology, or more appropriately, a martyrology. Like, you might ask yourselves, what are you talking about? How can you say we didn't have history before the 19th century? Well, we really didn't. What we tended to have, for example, was Ibn Daud's work, which is kind of like, this was the person who ruled Israel at this time, and this is the person who ruled after. There's long lists of things, a couple of little bits of, and then there was a war, and these people won, and so on, but no real analytical, thematic development of why things changed, why things developed, why things diverged, and why things came together. That's really what modern history is all about, and nobody had done that before Graetz. So he undertook, with very little resources and with prodigious effort, working in multiple languages without archival sources, he was able to essentially create a coherent narrative of Jewish history, meaning a storyline that made sense throughout the ages, that inspired Jews like no other literary work since the Bible or the Talmud ever had. It's a very, very impressive achievement, and that's why it was the bar mitzvah gift of choice for about a century. So his life, however, was not without significant controversy, not without significant personal defeat and embarrassment. So we're going to look at some of those aspects of his life as well and try to understand, what is the meaning of his contribution and what were the challenges that he faced in so creating it. Okay, so his youth. He came from an important and divisive area of Europe, the Posen or Poznan region of northern Germany and Poland. This is a region which, when he was alive, was part of Germany. It was Prussian Germany. You can see it's up here in what would be today northern Poland. The population was kind of mixed. It was culturally dominated by Germany, politically dominated by Germany. The cities tended to be German-speaking, and the Jews, who were Yiddish-speaking, tended to be Germanotropic, meaning that they were drawn towards the titular nationality, the Germans. The population as a whole, however, was Polish. And they were highly distinct from the Germans. They are Catholics, they are Slavs, they speak a different language, and so on. And there was a significant amount of tension that went back and forth over the 19th century and well into the 20th and even the 21st century to a certain degree. The region, of course, was ceded to Poland after World War I. It became an independent country, and it was one of the regions that Nazi Germany especially coveted during the 1930s, and eventually they took it over and annexed it to Germany proper. Well, there's a lot to say about that, but basically this is the region where Graetz grew up. He was born in a fairly small town, and he had a traditional yeshiva education until the age of 19. That yeshiva education, even in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, meant that there was no formal study of sciences, certainly not of literature. Only the very basic mathematics that would be necessary for elements discussed in the Talmud, like the sometimes complex astronomical calculations, things like that. But basically, he had no access to modern European university studies whatsoever, and he was an autodidact as a result. He taught himself. Like many Jews from this part of the world in this era, he essentially read whatever he could in whatever language he could. So, by the age of 19, he encountered a figure who would be an incredible influence on him, the incomparable Samson Raphael Hirsch. When I put this on the internet, I'll give you a little link. We spoke about him a couple of years ago. He's an extremely influential thinker who continues to have an impact on the choices that Jews make today. A rabbi very active in central Germany during most of the 19th century, and he's usually associated with the modern Orthodox movement. I'll take a moment in a few slides to explain what exactly that means in the 19th century. At any rate, Rabbi Hirsch, who's shown here as a young man, wrote a very powerful book, which in German, he was quite unique in that he chose not to compose most of his works in the literary rabbinic language of Hebrew. He chose to speak in the vernacular, to speak specifically to people like this young student Graetz, who was so brilliant and so talented in so many languages and so on, but had no outlet for his yearning. So Hirsch wrote this book called The 19 Letters, which is still very fresh and readable even today. It's basically a series of letters between an older man and a younger man, with the younger man questioning his Jewish identity, wondering, is it worth it? I mean, the outside world has so much to offer. There's so much culture and so vibrant, and why am I focusing all of my personal intellectual energies in this very narrow scope of human civilization when I could be involved in the whole world? And so this series of fictional letters go back and forth, in which Hirsch takes on the role of the older, I think it's an uncle, who writes to his nephew, if I remember correctly, I think his name was Benjamin, and explains to him, exactly why being immersed in Jewish study is of great value. And of course, the storyline eventually moves the son towards greater and greater involvement, to the younger man into involvement. So Graetz read this book and he said, oh my gosh, it is talking directly to me. These are my questions, these are my issues, and I need to find out these answers. So he wrote to Rabbi Hirsch and he said, I have to learn more from you. And so Hirsch invited him to his home. I think he was in Frankfurt at the time, and Graetz ended up living in his home for 3 years. He was a guest in his home, studying directly from his master for 3 years, and had a huge impact on him. They would later have a painful break in which the teacher would repudiate the young Graetz, but that's getting ahead of the story a little bit. I want to show you something that's kind of like a visual joke. This is kind of funny. You saw this picture here. This is a famous, iconic picture of Hirsch when he was a young man. So I saw a version of this that was kind of in one of a little bit more right-wing publications, and they did this to it. Here he is. I think they felt that his beard was just a little bit too thin, so they gave him kind of like a little bit heavier beard with a mustache, and so on, just drew it in. I think I'd like to go to them I could use a touch-up myself, I think, maybe on the forehead or something. But I just found that kind of amusing. Okay, anyways, that's where he received most of his education. Okay, questions to this point? Any arguments, discussions? Yes?
Said translated. What was it translated
to? It was translated from German to English. The original was written in German. Yes, Ms. Abramson.
Was Hirsch's book accepted while he was alive, or had to be after he passed away?
No, absolutely. It was extremely popular in his lifetime. It was one of the books that really the question was, how was Hirsch's book received. And was it posthumously famous or while he was alive? It was like an immediate classic. Because again, it's hard for us to understand this kind of situation because we live, you know, Art Scroll started in the late 80s, right? And now it's, what, 40 years later? Oh my gosh, it's close to 40 years later. So we're so used to having tremendous amounts of Jewish literature available in fairly readable English. You know, there it is. You want the Zohar, you want whatever it is, go pick it up. There's not necessarily Art Scroll, but you'll find it. But back then, in the beginning of the 19th century, in Germany, we should not overestimate the level of cultural illiteracy among Jews in Germany. That they were, you know, as Isaiah says, mitzvahs ish milumada, a lot of them were just following the traditions because their parents did. They did not have deep textual information. They were not inspired by their faith. They just went along with the motions because that's what people did. And, you know, you can only put up with that for a certain amount of time, and then you say, what is this all for? So when people like Hirsch would write in the vernacular, and people would pick it up and say, wait a minute, I had no idea how profound Judaism was, it was incredibly popular. Even more popular was his greatest work, which is translated into such a dense, difficult English that you really need the German to figure out some of the translation. But his great work, Chorev, which was named after Mount Sinai. Chorev is one of the names of Mount Sinai. And he essentially undertook a task that had not been done in 700 years of Jewish literature. Not since the Sefer Achinuch was written in Barcelona by Rabbi Aaron, anonymously. Rav Hirsch went and wrote a philosophy of the mitzvot. Why do we do all these mitzvot, all these commandments? Very, very powerful and influential book, and continues to have an impact today. Okay, so that hopefully answers your question. Does it? I hope so. It wasn't. Yeah, what's your question? I just took a long time to answer it. Okay, anyways, all right. Okay, so anyways, now Hirsch was embroiled at the time in an incredibly difficult controversy that would ultimately resolve itself, at least for the next couple of hundred years, in the expression of several Jewish denominations. This is a relatively new thing in Judaism. Judaism has experienced throughout its history several schisms where, for example, a group of Jews would reject the Talmud and they would form another group, let's say, called the Karaites. Before them you have the Samaritans for different reasons. But by and large, we may have had ethnic divisions and cultural idiosyncrasies that are related to geographic settlement, but we never had like doctrinal divisions that split us into very distinct groups. You could perhaps say the Hasidic movement was one such group, although one of the key distinctions, as Rabbi Beryl Wine puts it, one of the key distinctions is Jews can argue about almost everything. The only time the debate gets kind of finalized is when they argue about who is a Jew. You can argue about whether or not this is permissible or not permissible on the Sabbath, but when it gets to the point saying that my children cannot marry your children, then it feels like it's no longer a family argument. And so we're in that period right now in the 19th century because ultimately one of the questions that would be raised is the issue of matrilineal versus patrilineal descent. What defines a Jew? A Jewish mother? A Jewish father? Something else? We won't get into it deeply, but let's look at the major players and see how Rav Hirsch fits in because, of course, this has tremendous impact on Heinrich Graetz. So the first figure is Abraham Geiger, who is regarded as the figurehead of what was then known as the liberal movement. Later in America in particular, it's known as the Reform movement. Contrary to popular opinion, Geiger was not like a philosopher who came up with the idea that eventually formed the movement. He was rather a response to a grassroots movement that spread all over early 19th century Germany. There were many, many Jews who were looking at the possibility of emancipation, that is, of being given equal citizenship with Germans, as it happened in France in the late 18th century. And they felt that the only way we're going to do this is if we can prove to our non-Jewish co-citizens, so to speak, that we are deserving of citizenship, that we are normal people, that we have the same values and that they can trust us. They can include us in, their vision of a united German people. And so this often was expressed as the jettisoning of Jewish cultural practices which were seen as non-Germanic. So, for example, the synagogue layout was completely changed so that there was no longer a separation between men and women. You had family seating with men and women in the same areas. The synagogue arrangement was already also shifted around to make it more church-like, with, instead of having the shulchan in the center and the prayer leader having his back to much of the rest of the congregation, the prayer leader would stand at the front like a priest and face the congregation for much of the prayers and so on. A lot of changes like that to make, if a German Gentile walked into a Reformed synagogue, he would sort of understand what was going on. Of course, one of the big issues was the language of the prayer book, which would prove to be very seminal in creating a split, but I'll get to that in a second. So Abraham Geiger, at any rate, around him, already in the second decade of the 19th century, you have this burgeoning movement of Jews who are simply ignoring, abandoning, reforming the Jewish tradition in the interest of a new Judaism that would be more appealing to the Germans around them, and that would hopefully, I mean, looking at it to be done to look at it in a positive light, that would hopefully inspire millions or hundreds of thousands of Jews who were simply not inspired by the tradition. That Orthodox Judaism, the term of course had not been coined at that time, but Orthodox Judaism had failed to inspire the youth, and so this was one response that proved to be the most popular at the time. This was the case until the 1840s, when at a convention of Reform rabbis, again the term liberal was used then, one of the discussions revolved around the use of Hebrew in the liturgy, and there was a strong movement to simply change the language of the prayer book completely to German. I mean, most people simply did not understand the Hebrew. And why are you coming to synagogue just to repeat words that you have no idea what they mean? You can't use a translation, it just doesn't work. So therefore, there was a movement to simply remove Hebrew, and Zacharias Frankel, shown here, removed himself. He said, this is too radical a change. We do not approve of such a dramatic split from the traditional liturgy, and so he split from the Reform movement and created what was then called the historical positivist, and later in America, the conservative movement. So it's like a break off from the original Reform. And at the same time, just to make it more complicated, there's Moses Sofer, known as the Khatam Sofer in Eastern Europe. The other two figures are primarily in Germany. Moses Sofer is in northern Hungary. He looked at these things with a traditionalist viewpoint and said, this is completely inappropriate. And the modern society that is potentially making available to Jews all of the trappings of university education, non-Jewish culture, music, theater, dance, literature, and so on, it has to be completely walled off from our society, and therefore he said, we will not have any truck with modernity whatsoever. And so this forms what we would call today the ultra-Orthodox response to modernity, which is kind of to shut it all out and to try not to engage in modernity, even when it doesn't necessarily look like it could be dangerous. So here we have three, if you include Rabbi Hirsch, four distinct approaches to modernity, and let's look at how Heinrich Graetz fits in them. So here I'm going to give you a very quick chart here. It looks like this. If you take a spectrum and you put on it on one side openness to outside culture, I mean, you want to measure these various ideologies in terms of what do they believe about the outside world? Is it fundamentally toxic, or is it potentially beneficial for a Jew to be involved in cultural causes that are not necessarily Jewish in origin? And you go to the other side and you say, no, Jews have to remain totally insular. They have to stay away from anything that smacks of non-Jewish origins, and they have to stay totally within the framework of Jewish sources only. So if this is your spectrum from left to right, on the left side we could put Reform and Abraham Geiger, meaning in terms of the questions of how open to outside sources Reform would be, or Jews would be, this would be the most liberal of those approaches. So in other words, the most open to going to the opera, studying foreign philosophies, foreign religions even in university, things like that. You'll find this on this side of the spectrum. On the other side, you have the so-called Charedim, which is a Hebrew term meaning the tremblers, the ones who tremble, and it's often translated into English as ultra-Orthodox. What that means also is there are two major forms, the so-called Yeshivish, which is basically Lithuanian Talmudists, the Mitnagdim we spoke about a few weeks ago, or the Hasidim. They're both within this camp, and that would be Rabbi Moshe Sofer's approach. And then in the middle here, where you have a large number of Jews, you have what we would call today conservative, that is not as open to outside society as Reform is, and that's Zechariah Frankel's position. And then you have the modern Orthodox, which is not as insular as the extreme ultra-Orthodox, meaning they value a level of engagement in society, but not so much, for example, that they would consider moving the Sabbath to Sunday or violating the laws of kashrut and so on. And that would be Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And basically, Jews in the 19th century, and today as well, had to kind of put themselves somewhere on this spectrum. Choice of this nature was not possible before the 19th century. Before the 19th century, Jews either had to conform to community standards or convert to Christianity. There was no secular Jewish identity. There was no, hybrid Jewish identity. You just did what was around you, or you faced social ostracism that could have, especially in the pre-modern period, it could actually have financial consequences, because the Beit Din could fine you for, let's say, smoking on Saturdays. So, okay, smoking on Saturdays would count. Or the Beit Din could even have you lashed for failure to conform to community sensibilities. So Jews basically, went along with what was the community standard. Once you get to the 19th century and the possibility of choice was made available, then Jews did choose, and they put themselves somewhere on this chart. Okay, questions? Yes, okay, not a hard one, please.
It would even have applied to the appearance. In other words, how one appeared as, as being involved or being completely isolated in terms of the traditional garb. And if I'm not mistaken, that Hirsch's motto was to be in your house, the Jew, and in public to pass yourself up as any German would look in public.
Very good. I'll restate that for the internet audience. The observation was related to the way a Jew would appear, in terms of dress and in terms of shaving the beard and things like that. And the quote about being a man at home and a Jew at home and a man in the street, it's been attributed to many different figures, including Moses Mendelssohn and A.D. Gordon and others. I think it would be fair to attribute it to Samson Raphael Hirsch, but Denis Malko, you got to move the camera. I guess you must be enjoying the lecture, because here I am standing on the other side of it. Meanwhile, everyone on the internet is saying, why are we looking at the Israeli flag for the longest time? Okay, so anyways, lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so the way you would look. So Hirsch would, for example, approve of, beards are a good example. So it's forbidden by the Torah to take a straight edge razor to shave your beard. You can use an electric razor for different reasons, because it's basically considered like scissors, an electric razor. But to use a straight edge razor is forbidden by the Torah. So before electricity was invented, what did men do? So they either used a straight edge razor or they used depilatory powder.
That's right.
It smelled. It's made of lye. It was painful and awful, right? But that you got a really clean shave. But those were the only two choices. So you could either subject yourself to the smelly and painful depilatory powder, or you broke Torah law and you used a straight edge razor. So most observant Jews grew a beard, but the ultra-Orthodox said, don't touch it at all. Let it grow wild, let it just be. That's why many Hasidim today will allow their beards to grow untrimmed. But Rabbi Hirsch, of course, living in German society in an urban environment, that would look unkempt and inappropriate. So he said, take scissors, which is sort of a moderate approach, and trim your beard so you look like a mensch. And of course, you'll have people on the left, Abraham Geiger, who's clean shaven. I don't know how he did it personally, but that would be perfectly okay, because the whole idea of the razor is not seen to have as much, moral authority as it would in the Orthodox tradition. Yes, question.
Do you think that the conservative movement and the reform movement at that time saved many Jews from converting to Christianity?
That is a very profound question, which I will repeat for the audience. Do I think that the conservative reform movement saved many Jews from converting to Christianity? So, we don't have good data. We don't have good, census data or Gallup polls to look at and to ask people back then, why did you choose to affiliate with the Reform synagogue or a conservative synagogue or an Orthodox synagogue? We don't have that kind of data. That kind of thick description would help us understand. But there's basically two arguments, and I won't take a position on either of them. One argument is to say that the creation of these movements accelerated the rush to conversion, which was rampant in the late 19th century, because it provided a way station. And you could, as it were, stop observing the Torah according to the traditional practice, and you see that nothing happens, no lightning bolts, and so therefore you just make the next step. Others would say that no, this was kind of like a safety net, that many Jews, when faced with the choice of converting to Christianity or remaining Orthodox, they would definitely convert to Christianity. So those are the two positions. I'm not prepared to take a stance on it right now. Later on, we can talk about America, where we have the Pew study. We have a lot of data where we can ask that question again and wonder what it means. But it's a very different environment, because in the 19th century, everybody's Bubby and Zaidi were traditionally Orthodox. So it was like they were moving from something that they actually knew, as opposed to our generation, which doesn't necessarily have that background. Anyways, where's Heinrich Graetz in all this? Right over here in the middle, smack in the middle. Okay, he's obviously a huge devotee of Rabbi Hirsch. He lived in his home for 3 years, was his personal student, and so you'd think he would be modern Orthodox, but he happened to agree very strongly with Rabbi Frankel of the conservative movement, who argued for adaptations to Jewish tradition, but not so fast. Keep a hold of Hebrew. He strongly supported the conservative movement. He also strongly supported the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which was a modern scholarly movement that Abraham Geiger was involved with. So his leaning towards these positions on an intellectual level really estranged him from his former teacher. Later, when he came out with his major magnum opus on Jewish history, that's when the break would be final, and Rav Hirsch would say that, these are all very nice stories and imagination, but they're not necessarily true. And he really had nothing more to do with Graetz at that point. But anyways, this is putting him on the spectrum. He's a former yeshiva boy from Poland. He grew up, spent his emerging adulthood in a modern Orthodox home, the modern Orthodox home under Rav Hirsch, and then he moved a little bit to the left because of the influence of the Reform and Conservative movement. Okay, so let's go further on here. Now, this is his greatest book, without question, The History of the Jews. This was a work that ended up extending over 10 volumes in the original German, and as I mentioned in the introduction, had a phenomenal impact on German Jewry. It was like just an earth-shattering book that took decades to complete. He actually started with volume 4, and then he filled in the later volumes and then went back, and after a trip to Israel to actually be in the land of Israel, he wrote the volumes on biblical Israel. But by the time he was done, it was 10 massive volumes, a phenomenal achievement of scholarship. The reception, as I mentioned earlier, was immediate and very positive. And one of the reasons for this is because of his the narrative. And this is something a little more sophisticated that I try to explain to my more advanced history students, when they're working at the undergraduate level. one of the big misconceptions about how historians do their job is that we sort of kind of capture all these facts and then we put them all down. To quote one 18th century historian, wie es eigentlich gewesen war, the way it actually happened. Like, you need a good historian to go out there, get you the good facts, put them in the right order, and then you'll know what actually happened. But the problem is, it's not like that. The world of facts is kind of like the world of Google, right? There's like so many, overwhelmingly many facts to choose from. And you have to sift through them, and you can't possibly look at them all because there are just way too many, and you have to try and like tease out of the facts that you're able to see what are likely to be true and what constitute trends, what facts lead to one another, and then at some point you have to commit this to writing. Sometimes I like to explain this to my students as like, let's say you're writing the story of your own life. So if you wanted to write the story of your own life with mind-numbing accuracy, it would take you exactly as long as you have lived. Like, I'm 51 years old now, so I would have to like put a tape recorder on my life for 51 years. 8 hours of sleep every night, everything would be included there, and that would be really the whole my life story. But who would watch it? I mean, that's ridiculous. You need a considerably condensed version. Nobody can take more than, let's say, 6 hours of my life. That's it. I thought that was funny, but okay. All right. So historians have to like make choices. What facts go in? What facts go out? And as soon as you make those choices, you create a narrative. A coherent story, the word story is right in the word history. You create a story that makes sense, that life sort of seems to have some kind of meaning. There's a trajectory. It's not all one accident after another. It seems to have some kind of flow and build up, and there seems to be like a climax and this denouement. It seems like a literary work. That's how we like to think. That's how we remember things, and that's how we want our histories to work. So the narrative that Graetz started, and Graetz, you'll recall, was the pathbreaker here, because no one else had really written anything like this. He wrote what was later called by another encyclopedic historian, Salo-Baron, the lachrymose model of Jewish history. He did not mean it as a compliment. Lachrymose means full of tears. And put in a sentence, the lachrymose model that Graetz promoted was that despite overwhelming and consistent persecution, Jews succeeded and contributed to world civilization by dint of their great intellect and superior moral standing. That's one sentence, the lachrymose model of Jewish history. So every time you talk about a period in Jewish history, you'll describe how the Jews were persecuted, and nevertheless they came out surviving and doing something good for society and being like a light unto the nations. This is a really good narrative. I like this narrative. It makes me feel good to be a Jew, right? Because you say, wow, look at all the tremendous suffering and awful, terrible things that have happened to us, and yet, no, we're still, 7% of Nobel Prizes and things like that. That's the model. Now, there's a lot of good things to say about that model, and I think there's a lot of emes to it. There's a lot of truth in it. But it is, nevertheless, very monolithic, and it also ignores anything that contradicts that tangent of the narrative. It contradicts when Jews maybe didn't necessarily live up to their moral standing, the standards that they have depicted in their literature. It ignores the times when Jews simply disappeared through assimilation or conversion to other faiths and never looked back. It ignores the villains of Jewish history. There's all kinds of things, and it ignores also, by and large, the periods of time, which were unfortunately not that frequent, when Jews were actually very well treated in their societies. Certain period of time in Babylon, for example, certainly Spain, modern America, which he didn't treat very much because of the period. So it is a somewhat limited model. But let's put it in the context. This is the very first model you're going to put out there. And if you are going to start with one narrative, this is a huge narrative to develop national consciousness. Because here you have these Jews who are on the verge of assimilating, on the verge of converting out, and when they read Graetz, they say, oh my gosh, like we said last week in German, right? In Russian, Очень счастливый я, потому что я еврей. I'm so fortunate to be a Jew. You read Graetz and you say, my gosh, thank you, Bubby and Zadie, for buying me this book for my bar mitzvah present. You know, actually, the copy I have in my library, I have a personal copy, the 1899 printing in English, and it's beautiful with leather, you know, covers and binding and stuff like that. And on the front page, it's, you know, it's a bar mitzvah present to some boy. I won't mention his name because maybe his ancestors might watch this video one day. And then volume 2 has uncut pages, meaning, you know, back then they used to make the books with the pages actually sealed on the outside, and you had to take a sharp knife and cut them open. So obviously he didn't make it to the second volume, but nevertheless, that's really what this book was about, and it made a huge splash in the Jewish world because it made everyone so proud to be a Jew. And it was written in literate German with properly sourced materials at a very high level. And this is, by the way, for a person who was not allowed to get a PhD at his university of choice because they simply had a policy, no PhDs for Jews. Sorry, question in the back.
Does he have any religious perspective in it?
Absolutely. His religious perspective is essentially like this slide we have over here. That, you know, he's like Zacharias Frankel, and by the way, both of these guys were historians too. Not encyclopedic like Graetz, but he takes a critical approach to the sources. Like, for example, just because the Talmud says something happens, he doesn't automatically believe it did. He wants to look for outside ramification. He wants to look for literary interpretations, things like that. So he takes the Talmud as a source, but not necessarily as authoritative. And that makes him more of a modern historian who will approach sources with that kind of critical eye. He is religious in the sense that he believes in God. He believes in Jewish destiny. He believes in the value of the Torah, although not necessarily in the literal interpretation of the Torah as received by the Orthodox. He's very Orthodox friendly compared to other historians, but he's not like, you know, a Bible thumper, so to speak. Okay, yes, Fred.
Was this published serially?
It was published, thank you, serially. He published the 4th volume first, a couple years later the 5th, 6th, went up to I think the 9th, and then his trip to Israel, I think it was in 1872, he went back, wrote volumes 1, 2, 3, and then he came out with the final volume in I think 1877. So he wrote it, you know, in a kind of a haphazard fashion, and then it was immediately translated, reprinted, several editions, abridged, you know, things like that, and it was, I don't know how many times it was reprinted, but literally tens, maybe 100 times reprinted. Different languages. Okay, yeah, last question, then we better go on.
Who did the authoritative translation?
The one that's most popular in English is... it's done by a woman. Her first name was Bella. I think her last name is Rowe, if I remember correctly. Published by the Jewish Publication Society, 1899 to 1905. I wish I could remember her last name. I'm sorry. That's a hard question, though. We don't allow hard questions here. Just easy questions. The idiosyncrasies and biases associated with it. There are a few things you can definitely, you know, any work of this size, you're going to find points to criticize. And I'm not going to nitpick about, you know, facts, but in terms of his sort of biases. Do you recognize the picture on the verso here, the title page? It's Moses Mendelssohn.
Is it?
Right? Not a coincidence, because Moses Mendelssohn is exactly the kind of figure that's a hero for Graetz, right? Because Mendelssohn, you know, he's persecuted, not allowed to get into schools, not allowed to get in, but he's so brilliant, he beats Immanuel Kant in an essay competition and so on, shows the world what Jews really can do. So Mendelssohn is definitely his kind of hero. And anything that didn't really fit with the Mendelssohnian view of the world was not necessarily well presented in Graetz. So, for example, he thinks Kabbalah is total nonsense, and he says, why are the Jews even talking about this stuff? So Kabbalah is presented as, you know, superstitious nonsense that, you know, it's an unfortunate kind of byproduct of excessive persecution, that we retreat to mysticism. Hasidim, he thought they were all bumbling idiots, not well educated at all, and expressing themselves in all kinds of narishkeit. And unfortunately, once again, it's because of the Khmelnytsky rebellion that destroyed the communities. They didn't have proper teachers, Nebuch, they couldn't learn German. So he has, in general, a fairly, low opinion of Eastern European Jews. Again, remember where he comes from, in that Poznan region where the Jews are Germanotropic, and he looks at these Jews who can't even speak proper German, that they have so much Polish and Ukrainian and Russian mixed in there. He just wants nothing to do with them. So, and he was also tended to be very weak in social history. Like, he was very much a proponent of the so-called great man in history model that believes that history, all of us kind of like just sort of follow great men, usually white men. We follow what they say, and we'll follow along behind them until another great white man says something else, and then all of us plebeians move over and follow that white man. So his history tends to be a lot of disjointed biographies, as opposed to later historians like Shimon Dubno, who really emphasized folk movements and really emphasized the power of the masses, not necessarily the leaders, for shaping Jewish history. So the history as itself has some weaknesses, but again, placing it in context of an incredible achievement for its time. Now, there were some decidedly negative what's the right word? Things that happened. The word in Hebrew I'm looking at is totzaot. There must be a word in English. Consequences, thank you. Great consequences for his work. Most of it came from this man here, Heinrich von Treitschke, who was the leading German encyclopedic historian of the time. The Germans were about 100 years ahead of the Jews when it came to writing books of this nature. And von Treitschke read Graetz's book and was incensed. He said, I can't believe how this Jew is portraying himself in Christian culture, and especially in German culture. How dare he present himself as being, the Jews as being persecuted generation after generation, and what chutzpah. He actually didn't use the word chutzpah, but what nerve he has to proclaim the Jews' superior moral standing despite this persecution. He says that is so false. The Jews, we have tolerated them, he says, in German society, and they are a scourge on our society. They have, ruined our cities. They have infiltrated increasingly our universities. Our economies are torn up by their petty dealings and so on. And von Treitschke just chewed into Graetz as a kind of a national ideologue that didn't write history, he wrote propaganda. So if you remove all of the venom, if you remove all of the hatred and anti-Semitism that von Treitschke was expressing, his historical criticism of Graetz was not so far off. Graetz was writing a national history that was kind of like, like, for example, when you write a national anthem for a country, put it like that, right? Are you going to write, what do we have, America the Beautiful? So you have America the Pretty Good Looking, right? You're not going to write America the Pretty, you're going to write America the Beautiful. You're going to use the superlative, right? You're not going to say, God tolerate America. You say, God bless America. That's the point of a national anthem. So too, he's writing a book that's like a historical version of a national anthem. And it's supposed to be uplifting. It's supposed to make Jews feel good about who they are. He's not trying to write a dry scholarly treatise. There's like drama to it. It's a good read today. It really is. And von Treitschke would have none of it. He felt that it was tripe. He felt that it was, insulting to the Germans who had hosted the Jews for 800 years. And ultimately, he said the opposite. He coined this phrase, which you can see here in this Nazi rally from the 1930s, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. And this was one of Hitler's favorite slogans, borrowed from von Treitschke, who was criticizing Graetz, who was saying, au contraire, it's not like you say, Mr. Graetz, that the Jews have been such a boon to whatever society they've been in. They have been a cancerous growth that eat away from the society from within. And von Treitschke essentially trotted out this whole diatribe against Jews and how dangerous they are for society that was incredibly influential in the society. We should also understand that von Treitschke was not some, crazy drunken person muttering in the street. This was one of Germany's most prominent academics at a very prominent university late in his career, and for him to stand up and take such a strong stance against Graetz was perceived by many Germans as authoritative. So they had a fight called the Historikerstreik, a historian's battle that went on for close to a decade, back and forth in the press, and people in Germany took sides. People who were not involved in otherwise, began to engage in this dialogue of were Jews good for Germany or not? A very, very sad story that, of course, would come to its culmination with the Holocaust half a century later. Here's another. I'll show you, by the way, underneath it. I don't know why the Germans like to repeat themselves. It says the Jews are on luck. Then girls, women and girls, the Jews you're on bad fortune. It says over here in Gluck. Like it just says over right here. They are. Well, anyways, okay. It reminds me of a small funny incident. My wife and I were once in Odessa, and the water was not working in the hotel, and so there was a sign by the elevator. And it said in Russian, the water is not working. And it said in Ukrainian, the water is not working. Then it said in European languages, like in French, the water isn't working. It should be on again tomorrow. The same kind of thing in English. And then in German, it said the water isn't working. The plumber came. He says we need new pipes. He's going to have to order them from Kiev. It'll take till tomorrow. We hope we'll have it by 5 o'clock. Like the Germans wanted the whole story. It wasn't enough to just know tomorrow. Anyways, here's another slide also from the Nazi period. It's 1935, I believe. This is an outdoor billboard for an anti-Semitic paper called Der Stürmer, and here you can see the phrase, the Jews are our misfortune, meaning that everything that's wrong in Germany is because we have the Jews here in our society. And just to make it a little scarier, here is the same slogan, and this is from the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Nobody knew that they were there, but they're also quoting that same slogan of von Treitschke's, which was essentially an attack on Heinrich Graetz. So, to think about his legacy. Okay, Estebel, and then we'll do the legacy.
Well, just quickly, was he in the same period as Graetz, or did he follow him?
They were contemporaries, roughly the same age, and von Treitschke, the great elder statesman, this great historian, well respected across the country, and Graetz, older at that time as well, but the author of this incredibly well received. They were contemporaries. It was a really nasty fight. Now, how did Jews take this fight? Unfortunately, Graetz suffered some tremendous humiliation late in his life as a result of this fight. You recall that one of the collective projects of German Jewry for most of the 19th century was to desperately try to fit in, to desperately try to demonstrate to Germans that Jews are worthy of citizenship. And to a certain degree, Graetz's project fits within that model. But the huge embarrassment that many Germans felt with the rejection of Graetz by the scholarly community was so intense that in 1885, when a major institution was developed to study German Jewry by a so-called Jewish Historical Commission, they pointedly ignored to invite Graetz to participate, which was like he was the Nobel Prize winning nuclear physicist of the era, and they're not even sending him an invitation to participate. It was a huge slap in the face for Graetz, but it said a lot about what the Jewish community thought of him. They were at this point frankly embarrassed by his achievements because it had caused so much negative attention. His reputation extended internationally. French translations and English translations did not have the same kind of qualms about his his chutzpah and his fight with von Treitschke, because in America and in France, Jews had already earned equal rights, and so his reputation was solid there. But, you know, he was humiliated in his own country. But that nevertheless does not diminish the tremendous achievement that he made in his great 10-volume history of the Jews. He eventually succumbed to heart disease and was buried with significant honors in Wroclaw, if I remember correctly. And we remember him even today. In fact, just, you know, preparing for this lecture tonight, I think I'm going to have to go back and reread my Graetz. So even the pages that were not cut in volume 2, maybe I'll cut them myself this time. And I guess that's about it. I thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for participating. And I look forward to seeing you next week when I hope to speak about the Friedricher Rebbe, one of the most important Chabad rabbis of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, have a great night.